James Madison and the Struggle for the Bill of Rights.
Introduction. After the Constitution was written in the summer of 1787, and the Confederation Congress forwarded it to the states, delegates at many of the ratifying conventions became alarmed by the planned transfer of power to the new federal government. They worried that the states would no longer exist as independent sovereignties and would instead become subservient to a potentially oppressive and unaccountable central government. By June 1788, enough state conventions had approved the Constitution to launch the new government. But the bare minimum needed for ratification was not enough. Virginia, the largest state and politically powerful, and New York, fifth in population but of immense commercial importance, would have to join the Union or it was doomed. Now, imagine what might have been. After 3 weeks of passionate and intense debate, Virginia delegates at the ratifying convention in Richmond narrowly rejected the Constitution. Led by Patrick Henry, George Mason, and other anti-federalists, opponents of the Constitution demanded that a second constitutional convention be held immediately to propose amendments to return power to the states where the rights of citizens would be better protected. Couriers rushed to the New York ratifying convention with the news that Virginia had refused to approve the plan. That gave opponents of the Constitution the momentum they needed to prevent ratification there. Word quickly spread around the country that with Virginia out of the new republic, its most prominent citizen, George Washington, would be ineligible for the presidency. Because so many people had agreed to the new plan only because Washington would become the first chief executive, support for the Constitution quickly eroded. 6 months later, a chaotic second constitutional convention was held. Anti-federalists, who outnumbered supporters of the Constitution at the convention, dominated the proceedings. The delegates could not decide what to do. Some tried to limit the convention to considering amendments to alter the structure of government and add protection for individual rights, while others wanted to start fresh with a new constitution. Unlike delegates to the first convention in Philadelphia who were able to compromise, the members of the Second Assembly had been instructed by their state legislatures not to negotiate on important issues. The convention was hopelessly stalemated, and the delegates returned home to tell state officials that adding amendments or writing a new plan of government was impossible in the current climate. With no viable federal government in place, states formed regional alliances and established ties to foreign nations. Northern states joined together and sided with England. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia created a Southern Confederacy aligned with France. Citizens in the West banded together and chose Spain as their ally, so they were guaranteed access to the Mississippi River. Instead of a unified, affluent nation, America became a land of regional confederacies, each jealously guarding its independence, endlessly bickering with neighboring states, and threatening to use the military power of its foreign partner. What stood between this scenario and the nation's eventual history was a 5'4", 100-pound, shy intellectual with a quiet voice who worried almost constantly about his health and mortality. James Madison was a most unlikely candidate for this daunting task. Yet he played a central role at the most important events that shaped the nation's founding period, including the Constitutional Convention, the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and the First Congress, where he worked tirelessly to see the Bill of Rights approved. Without Madison, those 10 amendments, which became the foundation for individual liberty, might not have become part of the Constitution then or perhaps ever. This book tells the story of how Madison helped lead the Republic at its infancy away from a potentially bleak future toward the democratic society that he knew could exist and that the nation has become today. Chapter 1. The Philadelphia Convention. As James Madison waited to sign the Constitution in the historic Assembly Room where he had spent almost every day of the last 4 months, he knew that he and the other convention delegates, who had come from 12 of the 13 states and were some of the most distinguished citizens of the new republic, would never again be together. Although not sentimental, the shy and soft-spoken statesman from Orange County, Virginia, must have allowed himself at least a few moments to appreciate what had been accomplished in the State House in Philadelphia during the long summer of 1787. The magnificent room was the most hallowed place in the young nation. It was where the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775, and the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. Now the Constitution had been debated and written, and was ready to be signed within its protective walls. The convention was emotionally and physically draining for the delegates. Despite the summer heat, the windows had to be closed because the noise of carriage wheels and horseshoes hammering against the cobblestones in the street made it difficult for the delegates to hear each other. They also had decided to meet in private so they could speak freely, float ideas, and criticize each other's proposals without worrying about the reaction of fellow citizens in Philadelphia and back home. The delegates sat in pairs at tables covered with solemn green cloth adorned with candles and quill pens, whose feathers curved lightly upward from the inkwells. The tables were in a semicircle, while the president's desk, draped with the same unpretentious cloth, sat on a raised platform between two large marble fireplaces at the front of the room. George Washington quietly occupied the president's chair. So quietly, in fact, that he spoke only twice during the months the convention met. He broke his silence early in the summer to warn delegates not to let drafts of the proposed Constitution fall into the hands of others. On the last day, he endorsed a motion to increase the size of the House of Representatives to better reflect the diverse interests of the people. For the rest of the time, Washington's presence encouraged an aura of civility, even when the members of the convention energetically disagreed with each other on important issues. Occasionally he admonished his fellow delegates by fixing his intense gaze on those who spoke too long or offered proposals that Washington believed would not be good for the new nation. James Madison didn't sit with the others during the debates. Day after day, for 6 to 7 hours, Madison sat at the front of the room with his back mostly turned to Washington so he could face the delegates. Madison wanted future generations of Americans to know why the framers had written the Constitution the way they did. Without missing a day, he took notes of almost everything said that was of importance and recorded all votes. The work, which he chose to do, was exhausting. He had to write furiously to keep up with his colleagues, who spoke at a pace that would have challenged an experienced stenographer. Later he would say that his note-taking duties during the summer almost killed him. Now the day had arrived, September 17th, 1787. Madison watched as Washington stepped forward to be the first to sign his name to the Constitution. As president of the convention and the nation's most revered figure, Washington deserved that honor. Without him, there would likely have been no convention. Washington was an imposing figure, almost larger than life. At 6'3", he was unusually tall for that era, and almost a foot taller than Madison. To many of his grateful fellow citizens, the 55-year-old general had the status of a deity. He led the colonies to victory against overwhelming odds in a brutal war that lasted 8 long years. Washington commanded a ragtag army that came close to defeat several times. Yet with perseverance, luck, and help from the French, he and his troops turned the tide of the war, and the victory gave the colonies the opportunity to form a new nation. At the end of July, when the convention adjourned briefly, Washington took a break from sitting for so many hours each day in the stuffy assembly room and traveled to the outskirts of Philadelphia with Governor Morris, a Pennsylvania delegate and friend. Morris had invited him to relax by trout fishing at a stream about 18 miles northwest of the city. It was hot and humid in downtown Philadelphia, and Washington must have looked forward to a few days in the country. But the future president had more than fishing on his mind. Shortly after they arrived, Washington left Morris and rode the short distance to Valley Forge, a place that held painful memories for him. One of the darkest times of the war came...